This is the Bat Flip Podcast. Now here's your host, Damien, David, and Matt.
Hey everybody, and welcome into another episode of the Bat Flip Podcast season previews. It's been a couple weeks since we've done one of these, but we're going to pick up where we left off here. Sorry for the delay. We're going to get to moving on them a little bit faster now that we're getting closer to the season, but we're picking up this one with the Washington Nationals. The Washington Nationals are a team that's still in a bit of a rebuild. They have some really interesting young players who are either getting to the big leagues this year or getting very close to the big leagues, though. So they are a very interesting team to talk about right now, and what in the phase of their rebuild they're in. So excited to get into it. David is with me tonight, and how are you doing, David?
I'm good. Getting ready to talk about some Nationals. Hey, the players have reported spring training has started. I know you guys talked about that earlier tonight, so hopefully you guys go listen to that last episode of the Bat Flip Podcast. I think maybe hopefully the final free agent breakdown, and we can start talking about actual baseball games here soon.
Yeah, we're recording this right after we recorded the podcast, or I did with Damien, and I'll probably put this up on Wednesday to kind of space it out a little bit, but yeah, I guess starting off, Washington Nationals. This is a team that won the World Series 6 years ago in 2019, but that was at the very end of their competitive window. That was the end of their window that they had, Ryan Zimmerman. They had Anthony Rendon before he left in free agency, and that ended up working out for the Nationals that he left in free agency. They had Trey Turner. In the pitching, they still had a healthy Steven Strasburg and Max Scherzer and Patrick Corbin when he was still good. So that 2019 team, all those names have either gone elsewhere and they also had a young Juan Soto who has also gone elsewhere, where although that he could have been a part of them still if they had been able to extend him. But they had to go through a rebuild because their team, they were good from, I guess, about 2011, 2012 when Bryce Harper came up until 2019. And after 2019, they started to get older. They started to lose some guys to free agency. Everyone started having to get paid more, so they had to make some decisions on guys. So they ended up naturally going into a little bit of rebuild. And here we are in 2025, and the rebuild has really been a pretty quick and what seems to be likely a successful one, because they have gotten some really good prospects. I mean, they absolutely destroyed the San Diego Padres in the Juan Soto trade in getting prospects, especially with the fact that obviously Juan Soto is a great player, but the fact that he was only there for a year and a half in San Diego and getting the prospects that the Nationals got for him in a window in which the Nationals would not have won a World Series was a steal for them, in my opinion. And they've started to get some money come off the books. Really interesting team, David. Just kind of, what are your overall thoughts on this Nationals team, their phase of their rebuild they're in, and where we're looking at going into the 2025 season?
This is an interesting point, framework to point that at. First of all, I think that the Nationals won the trade in the sense that the other option was lose Juan Soto for a qualifying offer pick.
Correct.
Yeah. In that case, it's a win. But I think anytime you're trading away a top 5 player in baseball, top 3 player in baseball, you're losing the trade. It's just how it works. We will talk about a bunch of the pieces that were return pieces in that trade. A lot of those guys were involved in that deal. Some guys involved in that Trey Turner, Max Scherzer deal, which I still think was a terrible deal for this Nationals team. But those guys are still playing for this group. And then you have to, you can't talk about this Nationals rebuild without talking about this stuff that's kind of befell Steven Strasburg. I mean, he pitched him to a World Series, had a really, really strong 2010s. And then I think he pitched like 30 innings after that and retired. Like, it stinks how that went for a guy who was a generational talent at pitcher. One of the latest, like, he's just a starter that he ran out of gas, right? The mileage on his arm was just too much. Body wasn't able to keep up with it. And as he hit, 32, 33, that was just it. But he signed a huge deal in 2020 and, coming off of that World Series appearance, and he didn't pitch for any of it. So we talk about the Rendon deal being a saving grace, but they signed Strasburg with that same amount of money, and it didn't work out for him. That's not Strasburg's fault. That's not the Nationals' fault. I think the process was good. How can you predict that Strasburg's body is just going to break down like that? early in his 30s, we're seeing pitchers pitch later and later, right? Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer both got big contracts at past
Just
40 here. All right, Charlie Morton's pitching. So there's plenty of stuff that could have worked out for them, and Strasburg could still be here. That would have been inflating their window. But as it stands, right, I think the trades and the stuff, we'll leave that here in the intro. That it happened, right? They traded Juan Soto.
Yep.
The Strasburg thing happened. This team is not defined by that, though. The impact of that is going to be felt. Like all those moves is felt by this team.
Yeah. So moving on, speaking of trades and acquisitions, we'll go to what they've done this offseason. And, they've made some interesting additions. I think if you look at this list, I think the one that sticks out the most is probably Nathaniel Lowe, which was a really weird trade that the Rangers, who are in a competitive window, World Series champs year before last, traded Nathaniel Lowe to the Nationals. And it was kind of weird that the Nationals were buying, but they're getting a guy who's pretty young and has some control left. And very interesting trade there. And Nathaniel Lowe's going to slot in here, play first base. He's a good defensive first baseman. He's a really solid bat. Last year he put up about 3 WAR. I think he dealt with some injuries at times last year too. He only had 560 plate appearances, so he was about 50 to 100 plate appearances shy of what would be a normal season for him. And he's a really solid player that they brought in. One of the better players that we've talked about in this series so far. But they also they added a lot of depth in their lineup too. You had Josh Bell, just get a power bat, somebody who maybe will DH for them, and maybe has he randomly has a half season occasionally where he's really good. And if he has that half season for them, and they're out of contention at the deadline, which is kind of what we expect, you could flip him for something. Amed Rosario is a good depth piece, especially with the fact that you have some young left-handed bats in your lineup that Amed Rosario could platoon with a little bit. Guys like Luis Garcia, CJ Abrams. You've got some of those types of guys that you could give them a rest. Middle infield, he can play everywhere. That's definitely one to kind of look at. They brought in a few pitchers too. Mike Soroka is a really interesting pitcher that they brought in. Mm-hmm. He was a reliever at times last year for the White Sox and really kind of figured it out a little bit as a reliever. He really struggled as a starter. Obviously we know his injury history when he was in Atlanta, the 2 back-to-back Achilles tears. He came back for the Braves. It just wasn't the same. The stuff wasn't as good. His mechanics were adjusted. It just didn't work. And he did have some really good outings later last year as a reliever. So that's an interesting add. I believe the Nationals are going to start him off as a starter this year, but that's somebody who I think could definitely transition to relief pitching. Jorge Lopez is kind of he's okay, I guess. He's a good depth bullpen guy who's got some experience. And then Shinosuke Ogasawara, excuse me, I can't speak. He is an interesting ad from Japan who's had some success over there. So definitely, kind of a guy to look out for as kind of a mystery type. But David, out of these additions, which ones do you think are the most impactful for them? And obviously Nathaniel Lowe's probably at the high up on that list, but out of the kind of lower end ones, which one do you think would surprise maybe?
Surprise, I think, judging by what you said about Jorge Lopez, that'll be a surprise. Like Jorge Lopez last year for the Cubs was very, very good. I wanted the Cubs to bring him back. I thought once he left the Mets, he just seemed to have like something with the Mets where it just didn't work. He was that, he threw the glove in the stands and stuff. And once that all settled down and he got to the Cubs and kind of reset, he was back to the Jorge Lopez of old that got traded for some big prospects, between Minnesota and Baltimore, I think. So, that's a guy that I think he's still got like some good late inning relief stuff. He was throwing 96 at the end of the year, like very good pitcher, especially in the bullpen, and in a bullpen that right above my head right here, Kyle Finnegan is still a free agent, by the way. I think there's a pretty good chance he returns to the Nationals at this point because they do, where we're talking about Jorge Lopez, that's what Fangraphs currently has projected as the closer. I think Kyle Finnegan probably returns to this Nationals team at this point. But, in terms of guys who will surprise on this list, it's definitely Jorge Lopez for me, given your reaction. But the guy I was going to say is Mike Soroka. If he's able to translate the stuff that he figured out in the bullpen last year back into starting, that's going to be the Mike Soroka with the Braves that we thought was just a top prospect guy that could probably, be a really good pitcher for your team. He was one of those guys on my list. I was like, yeah, and if you could just whoever nails down Mike Soroka, that's going to be a really good opportunity.
Right.
That's really clear. Soroka wants to start,
Yeah.
and the starting pitching is where the money's made, right? So
Yeah, that's the thing.
If he can start, which this team is going to give him that opportunity, this is the way to go. And he's probably another. You talked about Josh Bell. Soroka is going to get offloaded at the deadline if he gets it. If he starts well in the first half. Trevor Williams is up here too. He isn't a subtraction. He did re-sign.
Oh, I'm sorry. I messed that up.
but it's worth noting, right? He's on here. He's an addition and a subtraction, right? Because he re-signed. He's gonna be good too, right? Trevor Williams has this. He's got like the sinker ball control, never walks anybody, soft contact arsenal that just works. And it works well in front of an athletic young defense that we're going to talk about. And I like Trevor Williams a lot, and that's why I'm glad he's on this list, even though he's technically on the other side.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention him because retaining him, I think, is really, really big for this team to maintain that consistency year to year.
Yeah, and we do have him in the pitching slide. I just, for whatever reason, when I was reading this off of Fangraphs and grabbed him because it had him on there twice, I guess. Right. But, speaking of the subtractions, there's not a ton to talk about here. A lot of it's kind of depth guys, bench guys. Joey Gallo was a high-profile player that they brought in last year on kind of one of those 1 year, like maybe he figures it out with us and we could trade him deals, and it didn't work. Patrick Corbin, obviously, we talked about him in our kind of intro as one of those guys that was part of the World Series team and then turned into a disaster contract. He's gone now. That money's off the books. He still pitched a lot of innings for them over the last couple of years, so that is a big a loss. Is in like they have to replace him, but they'll probably replace him with better.
He
Joey
might
Meneses,
come back.
It's possible. I mean, if he comes back, it's going to be on like a minor league deal or something.
It wouldn't be any impact. Yeah,
no impact. Joey Meneses, obviously he was a kind of a big story a couple of years ago. He came up and had a really good year or so. He just kind of is one of those first base DH types who has a good half season. It's why initially you would be worried about a guy like we talked about with Brent Rooker in a last episode we did. That's part of the reason you initially worry about him is because of guys like Joey Meneses, who comes up and does it. Of course, now Brent Rooker's done it 3 years in a row. I fully believe in Brent Rooker. Right. I'm just saying that that's why we have questions about those types of guys when it happens. But, and then the two relievers are both guys who have shown potential in the past. They've dealt with some injuries. So definitely interesting there. But there's not too much to discuss about the subtractions other than just they lost some guys who weren't very good for them. They're kind of in that phase of the rebuild where anybody who leaves is probably just not a part of the future. Not a big loss. So moving on, we'll go ahead and start talking about the position players here. Mm-hmm. So, this lineup is interesting because I don't think you can point to a player here except Josh Bell maybe, and maybe Jose Tena, who doesn't have the potential to have like a really good season at some point. Like they're all young. They all have some form of athletic upside or skill, something they do really, really well. I think all but maybe Lowe and Jacob Young were like top 100 prospects, including like CJ Abrams was like a superstar prospect. Keibert Ruiz was a super prospect. Dylan Cruz is a super prospect. James Wood is, as of like late last year before he graduated from the list, was a super prospect. They've got a lot of young talent that has a lot of pedigree here. And some of them have already started to establish at the big league level. And I think it starts with James Wood. He's the big piece here. He's the guy that could be their Aaron Judge. I mean, he's the guy that could be their next Juan Soto. I'm not saying he's going to be that. I'm just saying like he has that high end upside to him. Dylan Cruz is another excellent prospect, was the number 2 pick in the draft a couple years ago. He's had some form of concern with his minor league numbers. There's a few underlying things that are maybe worry you a tiny bit more than you were thinking when he first came out, but he's obviously a super high end prospect, going to be very good. And then CJ Abrams, like we mentioned, that's an interesting one to talk about. So I guess I'll ask you, David, out of these, James Wood, Dylan Cruz, and I guess Jacob Young, maybe, who was a rookie last year, I believe. Which one of these guys do you think is the guy for them?
I talked about it on our, the episode you and I did when we talked about rookie of the year. I thought Dylan Cruz is a real strong
Yep.
candidate to go out and win a rookie of the year. I'm going to lean into that a little bit because I just think Dylan Cruz is the type of hitter in a Brian Reynolds mold. I think Greg Ivy Futures comped him to Brian Reynolds back when we were doing the draft process on this. And that's such an impactful player for Pittsburgh. He got the last $100 million deal for Pittsburgh. Like, that's a guy that you could definitely see Cruz aspiring to, and he doesn't have to play center field. And I think that's the bigger item here, is that Dylan Cruz can play center field. He's very athletic. He's fast. He's early in his career. He's one of those guys, like kind of like Christian Yelich too, could easily play center field. He doesn't have to. He's already moved over to the corner spot. And if he can just focus on offense and developing, the swing to provide proper launch angles and really get things going, I feel like he can accelerate a lot faster than a guy like James Wood, who's going to be focusing on hopefully pulling the baseball. If James Wood could just pull the baseball a little bit, that'd be, I talked about it with Matt Shaw, right? Matt Shaw is awesome. He can pull the ball, take the ball the other way. James Wood only takes the ball the other way. He doesn't hit pole side home runs, but that's a guy with prodigious power. He's like 6'6". Yeah. So I want to see more out of James Wood. I want to see him pulling the ball. That's a developmental piece, but Dylan Cruz excites me because of the power speed combo and the fact that he's already moved off a center field. That's he can focus on stealing bases, not necessarily the defense, because Jacob Young is so good in center field. Yep. I like Dylan Cruz as kind of my guy in this outfield.
Yep. And I guess the one other thing with this team here is you have three guys, I think, in this lineup right now that are, I would call them post-hype, can they break out guys? CJ Abrams, who kind of has broken out, sort of, but not really. He's had a weird career so far. Luis Garcia, who has looked like a pretty solid big leaguer, but is there another level there? And Keibert Ruiz, who has had some signs of being solid, but has really struggled with his defense behind the plate and has kind of lost the power that he had at one point. So out of those three guys, which one do you think would be the most likely to kind of break out?
So funny, you say that, right? We just talked about three guys who are 26, Jacob Young, 23, Dylan Cruz, 22, James Wood. CJ Abrams is 24.
Yep.
Luis Garcia is 25, and Keibert Ruiz is 27. Yeah. This team is extremely young. Are. And I want to talk. I get to shout out my guy Luis Garcia, so I'm going to. He is he's like if Luis Arias had 20 home run power, but at a grade less on the contact tool. He just doesn't get the credit for it. He could play second base at a really good level. That is a guy that you want in your lineup. A good teams would want a guy like Luis Garcia in your lineup. He had 18 homers last year, almost went 20-20. CJ Abrams did go 20-20. He had 20 homers, 31 stolen bases last year. These two guys up the middle are really, really solid. The problem for CJ Abrams has been the maturity, but he's a guy who came up to the majors at like age 21. This is a guy that just has a lot of growing to do. And I'm hoping that these two guys over here, Josh Bell and Nathaniel Lowe, can provide some leadership to the rest of this group. I'll talk about it a little more when we get to the final thing. I feel like this team is like a player away in this group from being able to really do it. And it's what really stinks is they could have used a really good, solid hitter to mentor these guys.
Yeah.
Maybe they could still get it. Maybe Paul DeJong is that, right? He's up here in the corner. They just signed him the other day. I don't see that really working. My thing is the maturity for these three guys in the middle, but really everybody on this team, because they're all so young. In order for them to get somewhere, they've got to have some leadership. But this offseason was a really good opportunity for them to go out and sign a bargain deal on a really good player. And they just didn't really do it. I don't think Josh Bell is going to be that guy. Nathaniel Lowe, maybe. But I think Luis Garcia can be a leader on this team. I think he's the guy I would bet on of those three to have the really good season again, which he had one last year. So my guy to answer your question is Luis Garcia, but I am worried about the leadership on this team. And I feel like they could have done a little bit more, probably at third base. Third base is where I'm like, I think they missed.
Yeah, I'm with you. They probably could have added a third baseman, and they still might add one via some form of a trade, but we'll see. Looking at a few other things here, their bench is not terrible. I mean, Ahmed Rosario, we mentioned him, not terrible at all. Alex Call's pretty solid, projected for about one WAR, which is pretty good off the bench. He's got really good plate discipline numbers. So that's definitely something to kind of keep an eye on. Maybe he can platoon a little bit. James Wood, if he starts really struggling with that down and away slider, which is kind of a concern for him, really good right-handed pitching. Maybe you could give him a few days off for Alex Call, something like that. And then a couple prospects to know. Brady House is somebody who's gotten a lot of attention in the past. He's a big guy, got some power, a lot of raw power. I believe he was at third base, but he might end up being like a first base only type. And then Seaver King was their first round draft pick last year, and he had a lot of hype from some people. There was a lot of mixed opinion on him. So he's really interesting to look out for. He could play a factor this year as well. But moving on, what's up?
Two quick mentions. Robert Hassel and Elijah Green, two of their, they got Hassel in the Soto trade. Elijah Green, they drafted 5th overall. Their player development just hasn't been able to figure some of these guys out. And, and Seaver King is a big time project, right?
Yeah.
I am concerned that they won't be able to supplement these guys with those young development players, because the player development just doesn't seem to be on the same level as some of these other teams we've seen that have been able to crank out those prospects at a high level. They've gotten some good players, but we're seeing some development issues with these players. And then there's even worse issues in the minors.
Yeah, I will say with Elijah Green, that was a guy who, when he was drafted, people were saying this guy might never be above A ball.
Right.
But there's a chance that he's like the best player in baseball, but it's pretty likely he never gets above A ball. He was just one of those like super risky guys. It's kind of like James Wood in a certain level. And they hit on 50-50 on the two, which is great to me. I mean, I think that's great if you hit on 50-50 out of that type of guy. So, of course, we don't know for sure that they've hit on James Wood, but he is a big leaguer. So
that's a hit in my opinion.
It's a hit when you draft a guy. If he makes the big leagues, I would consider it at least some form of a hit.
They got Wood in the Soto trade, right?
That's right. Yeah, but acquiring him when he was young, he was still in the low minors when they acquired him. But either way, moving on, we'll talk about the pitching real quick. The pitching's a little bit more of a question mark, I would say. Mackenzie Gore is very interesting because this is like we mentioned, one of those top prospects. They got him in the Soto trade as well. And he's had some flashes and stretches of weeks at a time where he looks dominant. He looks like that number 3 overall pick that was the top pitching prospect in baseball. He looks incredible. And then he goes through phases where his mechanics break down and he walks guys, and he's dealt with some injuries at times. So what you get from Mackenzie Gore is this is a really big year for him, in my opinion. This is the year that he could either establish himself as a really good big leaguer and be on the kind of like that Blake Snell path, or he could end up just not ever having it, which is very possible. So Mackenzie Gore, big year for him. They've got some guys in here who I think they've got 4 number 5 starters right here. They have some depth. I mean, all these guys are capable big leaguers. We talked about Mike Soroka earlier as somebody who does have some upside still. He started to figure some things out in the bullpen last year. Maybe he is able to translate that back into the rotation. But those middle 3, we talked about Trevor Williams earlier. He's fine as just kind of a depth starter. He's a big leaguer. Mitchell Parker and Jake Irvin are pitchers who are not going to absolutely kill you if you got them in games, but you need better than this to really compete. And I think this is really their biggest weak point, is this pitching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I said they needed to do something else, I felt like one bat, couple of pitchers, right? Like they really could have splashed into this pitching market, and they just didn't do it. And we talked about the prospects. Cade Cavalli's decent. They've got like Travis Sikora and Susana, some young guys. There's not really help on the horizon for this team in terms of pitching prospects. And so that means that they're going to have a lot of this until they spend some money and try to, help Mackenzie Gore and drop these guys down. Worth noting, Trevor Williams is coming off a year where he had a 2.03 ERA in 66 innings.
Yeah.
If he could stay healthy, and I think he's probably better than a 5. I think he's probably in that 4 conversation.
4, yeah.
But again, that ERA, that WAR projection is including the risk of injury and the consistency at which Trevor Williams has not pitched regularly over his career. And then this bullpen it's just not very good.
Yeah.
Point blank, this might be one of the worst bullpens we've talked about. That's why I think Kyle Finnegan ultimately returns. It slots Jorge Lopez into that 8th inning role. Colin Poche, I like, but he's dealt with some really bad injuries. The velocity's fallen off for him.
He's a non-roster invite too. I went ahead and put him in here because he's
I feel like he's going to make it.
Yeah, but he isn't currently a big leaguer for them. He's a non-roster invite, so it's possible that he would not make it. But
right, it definitely is. But yeah, this bullpen's just not going to.
Yeah, the one thing I will say about this bullpen is you look at the age, and they have
young guys,
5 relievers that are 27 or younger, and I think that sometimes, typically, when you think of really good bullpens, you're thinking of established relievers. You're thinking of guys who are mid-30s. A lot of times, some of your better relievers, but sometimes you get that mystery out of these young guys and guys that might throw hard or have some form of, they used to be starters and they're transitioning to the bullpen. You don't know what you're going to get about them. So there is some volatility. I would imagine that at least like 2 of the Ogasawara or Reifert or Brzezicki, or at least 2 of those guys end up being at least decent relievers, and they hit on a couple of them because they're going to hit on somebody at some point out of all these younger relievers. But yeah, and you mentioned Cade Cavalli, Yarlin Susana. I forgot what trade he came over in. Was that the Soto trade? I think it was from San Diego that he came over, but he has established himself as a top 100 prospect now. So definitely somebody who's interesting to kind of look at. I believe Fangraphs has him at number 19 this year, coming into this year. So he is.
He was Soto trade, I think.
Yeah, he is pretty. He is a fairly volatile reliever or pitcher. So we don't know what we're going to get out of him, but the upside is definitely there. I don't know that he'll be in the big leagues this year. He's going to start off in Double-A. He's really young. He's about to be 21 years old. So,
I think we did forget one name here, and it's because Fangraphs doesn't have him on the list. But I think he'll probably actually start in the rotation. Is DJ Hers? Guy came over in the Candelario trade with the Cubs. Lefty, crafty, got a really, really high spin slider. And he's going to walk a ton of guys, but DJ Hers was pretty good for them last year.
Yeah.
So I assume
it'll be a battle.
88 innings.
Yeah, I should have mentioned him. It will be a battle with him and these other guys in spring training, I'm sure.
Pitching injuries are going to
see him.
Yeah, be there.
Yeah. I mean, they've got some form of former top prospect post-hype help too. Like Jackson Rutledge is another guy who was kind of a highly thought of prospect at one time, but definitely think. And then Josiah Gray, of course, is injured as well. We should probably mention that. He probably won't pitch this year. He had Tommy John surgery with the internal brace procedure last July, so probably not going to pitch this year, but just worth mentioning. He was somebody that they were counting on, and he really has been up and down so far, but we'll see. Maybe he comes back in 2026 and comes back strong. But moving on, we're going to look at the outlook really quickly. David, over-under win total is 72.5 for this team. I think I'm taking the under. I think this division is really, really tough, and I don't think the Nationals pitching is going to hold up in this division.
And they won 71 last year, and they're adding Dylan Cruz. I like a lot of their position players. You're right about the pitching. I'm going to take the over because when you said something about it, I suggested it was at 74. So I'm thinking it's going to be right around this. I think this is a good line. 73, 74 is probably what I'm betting on. Not much more, but I will take the over.
Yep. So their odds to make the postseason are plus 850. Odds to win the NL East plus 6,000. Odds to win the World Series plus 30,000. So definitely a team that has a long shot to really go anywhere this year. But like we mentioned, all these prospects and stuff, maybe in the future they'll take off here. So I guess that'll wrap it up for us here. We'll try to keep it under 30 minutes here. We appreciate everyone tuning in. Hope to catch you on the next one. I believe we're going to talk about the Pirates next. That'll be an interesting one. But thanks everyone for tuning in. Like, comment, subscribe. We'll see you on the next one.